Turn in your Bibles to 1 Samuel chapter 31. If you're reading one of the Bibles in your pew, it's page 239. Last week, Kirk Marks preached, and he walked us through chapters 28 through 30. We learned that the Philistines had summoned a massive army, and they were ready to attack Israel. Well, now in chapter 31, war erupts. Here's what we read in verses 1 and 2. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons, Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. Let's pause there a minute. We just read some really bad news for Israel. I mean, not only does their enemy, Philistia, win big, but 3 of the princes were killed. One of those was the crown prince, Jonathan, who was David's best friend. But the Philistines don't just want the crown prince. They want the big prize. Where is the king? Let's keep reading. The fighting grew fierce around King Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword, run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor-bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. When the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul and his 3 sons and his armor-bearer and all his men died together that same day. Now, for those of us who have been following the story of David for many months, as we have been, this is one of those bittersweet events. We've been rooting for David as he's been a fugitive on the run from Saul. That was all the way back in 1 Samuel chapter 15 that we learned God was taking the kingdom away from Saul. We knew this day was coming. In fact, it was the very next chapter, 1 Samuel 16, that God anointed David to be king. So we've known this for 3 months of sermons. It was all the way back on June 2nd that we knew that. We've waited long. But think about how long David has waited. More than likely, years. So there is a sense in which it is sweet to finally see God's promise to David fulfilled. But it's also bitter, because this was a massive loss of life. And there's no doubt, war is just terrible. In the midst of war, the horror of it all rains down on both the good and the bad. Yes, Saul dies, but we could kind of say, well, he was wicked. He knew it was coming. But Jonathan also dies. Jonathan was good. I mean, there's every evidence that Jonathan would have been an amazing king. But his life is cut short. Who's to blame for all of this? But Saul. Saul, who chose to turn away from God on numerous occasions. Saul, who brings this great pain and suffering on the life of Israel. We read that Saul, as he is mortally wounded, he decides to end it right there. He falls on his sword. He's probably trying to avoid torture. He would have been captured by the Philistines, and who knows what horrors they would have done to him. They wanted the king so bad. And so what this means is that the Philistines have won the war. But they haven't won the entire nation of Israel. We read in the account that people in the nearby towns, they fled. They did not want to face the overrunning Philistines. And so probably the armies of Philistia, they beat the military of Israel and they captured some border towns. When those soldiers, the Philistine soldiers, are stripping the Israelite soldiers of their possessions, they come across the bodies of Saul and his sons. They remove Saul's armor and they cut off his head. They then place his armor in one of their temples as kind of a sacrifice to their gods. And then they hang the wall on the wall of one of those Jewish towns, the body of Saul. It's brutal. That's war. It's gory. And the chapter ends as some incredibly courageous Israelites from nearby Jabesh Gilead sneak into the town of Beth Shan, where they had put Saul's body on the wall, and they rescue the corpses of Saul and his sons. Then they give them a proper burial and fast and mourn. And that brings us to 2 Samuel. There's really no gap in the narrative between 1 and 2 Samuel. They're just seamless. But before we jump into 2 Samuel chapter 1, think about what has just happened. The king is dead. 3 of his sons, including the crown prince, are dead. Who gets to be king now? It seems as though the narrator of the story at this point does have this issue of succession in mind, because look at who he brings up next. 2 Samuel chapter 1 verse 1 starts right in on David. It says, after the death of Saul, David returned from striking down the Amalekites and stayed in Ziklag 2 days. On the 3rd day, a man arrived from Saul's camp with his clothes torn and dust on his head. When he came to David, he fell to the ground to pay him honor. Where have you come from? David asked him. He answered, I have escaped from the Israelite camp. What happened? David asked. Tell me. The men, the Israelites, he is saying, fled from the battle, the man replied. Many of them fell and died, and Saul and his son Jonathan are dead. And then David said to the young man who brought him the report, how do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead? I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, the young man said, and there was Saul leaning on his spear with the chariots and their drivers in hot pursuit. When he turned around and saw me, he called out to me, and I said, what can I do? He asked me, who are you? An Amalekite, I answered. Then he said to me, stand here by me and kill me. I'm in the throes of death, but I'm still alive. So I stood beside him and killed him, because I knew that after he had fallen, he could not survive. And I took the crown that was on his head and the band on his arm, and I brought them here to my Lord. Then David and all the men with him took hold of their clothes and tore them. They mourned and wept and fasted till evening for Saul and his son Jonathan, and for the army of the Lord, and for the nation of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. It's dark. Just this ominous, awful, sad story. And I'm not just talking about the intimate details that this guy shares about the final moments of King Saul. It's dark when we realize that David is learning for the first time about his best friend Jonathan, his father-in-law and the king, Saul. Now at first, David and his men immediately go into mourning, as they would. This is terrible news. Tearing their clothes is a customary expression of that mourning. And you and I would probably say, you just ripped my heart out. We don't mean that literally. They actually literally ripped the clothes to express that ripping of emotion that they feel when they've lost something so dear to them. This was David's best friend. Maybe you felt that before, that ripping when you lose someone dear to you. And so it's right and good to mourn and feel the heaviness of the loss. But at some point that evening, as David is mourning, it's like this realization dawns on him. You can almost see a look come over David as he utters the words, wait a minute, what did that guy say? What I'm getting at is the fact that as we learned in David's recent past, he had 2 opportunities himself to kill Saul. And what did he do? He showed Saul mercy. Why? There's a catchphrase that David used in each of those 2 occasions when he showed Saul mercy. He would not kill the Lord's anointed. As David thinks about it, he realizes that this man who reported the news of Saul's death, that guy did kill Saul. Now, no doubt, what we heard in the guy's account was that Saul, he had fallen on his sword. He had been wounded by archers. He was in the throes of death. We don't know how much longer he had. Minutes? An hour? It wasn't much. The Philistines were on the way. They were going to take care of him regardless. And so the man only did this because of that. And Saul asked him to, the guy said. You can see the wheels turning in David's mind as he's thinking about that guy's story. There's also another factor. What was that man's ethnicity? He was an Amalekite. Where have we heard that recently? Look up at verse 1. In this very chapter, 2 Samuel, chapter 1, verse 1. David had just returned from striking down the Amalekites. Remember that story from last week? That's a callback to chapter 30 of 1 Samuel. It was the Amalekites who had sacked David's hometown there in Ziklag. It was the Amalekites who had carted off all of David and his men's family and possessions, while David and his soldiers were trying to join the war. It was David then and his men who inquired of the Lord, and the Lord said, yeah, go after them. They chased down the Amalekites and defeated them, rescuing all of their family and possessions. So how do you think David is feeling about the Amalekites just right about now? It's a bitter taste, to say the least, right? And here's an Amalekite saying he killed King Saul. Now, this is, in David's mind, a dark situation. And yet the Amalekite doesn't see it that way, right? So David calls for the man. Look at verse 13. David said to the young man who brought him the report, where are you from? You can almost see that David is just laying the bait right out in front of this guy. The trap is set. And the young man has no clue. Here's how he answers. I am the son of a foreigner, an Amalekite. You can see it just come over David's face. He could easily be thinking in this moment, that's what I thought I heard him say. He's an Amalekite. And he's an Amalekite who just killed our king. David draws him further into the trap. Look at verse 14. David asked him, why weren't you afraid to lift your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed? Ooh, there it is. Buzzword, the Lord's anointed. Remember, David used that buzzword in both of the situations when he had Saul right where he wanted him. You remember that? In the cave, and then out there when Saul was sleeping on the ground, both times David's men were trying to convince him, like, you got this, David. The Lord has set this up for you. And David's response is, I will not lift my hand against the Lord's anointed. But this Amalekite did. From this point on, it's lights out. Look at verse 15. David called to one of his men and said, go strike him down. So he struck him down and he died. For David had said to him, your blood be on your own head. Your own mouth testified against you when you said, I killed the Lord's anointed. I wonder how you feel about this one. Maybe you can go either way. It's a tough one because Saul asked the Amalekite to kill him. Saul was dying. We could say that the Amalekite man was actually merciful to Saul. Could be, maybe he didn't even want to kill Saul, but did so completely out of obedience. So we could say, David, hold off on this. This guy was merciful by finishing off King Saul. It was an inevitability. You weren't going to defeat the Philistines and take Saul and recover him at the hospital. He was just merciful. Like you were merciful to King Saul in the cave and out there at the camp. David doesn't see it that way. In fact, David really has no way to authenticate the man's story. How do we even know if the man's story is true? We don't. That whole thing about Saul pleading for a mercy killing, all David has to go on is what the man said, and the man admitted to killing King Saul. Maybe the man thought that as he brought this news to David that David would think he was a hero because David and Saul were at odds for years. Saul was trying to kill David. But no, David sees one thing and one thing only. Saul was the Lord's anointed. And it's wrong to kill the Lord's anointed, period. Even if Saul had minutes to live, even if he had seconds to live, it's wrong to kill the Lord's anointed. And David believes that the only action that is right and just in this very moment is to take the action of capital punishment on this Amalekite. And that didn't help the fact that he was an Amalekite. It's a tough story. It's one of those ones where you read it in the Bible and you could easily think, I don't like it. I get that. I wish David would have taken more time to investigate. How did it actually really go down there? How can we maybe authenticate this guy's story? There's almost a sense of Wild West justice in the life of David from time to time. We've seen this before, right? Remember a few weeks ago when Abigail, Nabal's wife, had to step in and stop David from slaughtering Nabal and his men. Sometimes I find David a little hard to figure. One moment, he has what appears to be this big emotional reaction, going so far as commanding capital punishment on this Amalekite. Split-second decision. The next moment, we find him writing a glowing eulogy for Saul and Jonathan. Look at chapter 1, verses 17 through 27. 2 Samuel now. 2 Samuel chapter 1, verses 17 through 27. Listen to what David does. David took up this lament concerning Saul and his son Jonathan, and he ordered that the people of Judah be taught this lament of the bow. It is written in the book of Jashar. And here it is. It's a psalm that David writes for them, a eulogy. A gazelle lies slain on your heights, O Israel. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Proclaim it not in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines be glad, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised rejoice. Mountains of Gilboa, may you have neither dew nor rain. May no showers fall in your terraced fields. For there the shield of the mighty was despised, the shield of Saul, no longer rubbed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the flesh of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan did not turn back. The sword of Saul did not return unsatisfied. Saul and Jonathan, in life, they were loved and admired. And in death, they were not parted. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. Daughters of Israel, weep for Saul, who clothed you in scarlet and finery, who adorned you with garments, ornaments of gold. How the mighty have fallen in battle. Jonathan lies slain on your heights. I grieve for you, Jonathan, my brother. You were very dear to me. Your love for me was wonderful, more wonderful than that of women. How the mighty have fallen. The weapons of war have perished. So this is a lament, we're told. Lament is holy complaint. It's a crying out, anguish, and mourning. And often in the Psalms, the laments were prayers to God, where the psalmist poured out their emotional feelings to God about the struggles that they're going through. So David's lament here expresses those very deep personal feelings about King Saul and Jonathan. And we learn in verse 18, it's called a lament of the bow. Scholars are a bit uncertain as to what that meant. One idea is that it was a song that David wanted all the archers in his military to learn as they were practicing, almost as like a prayer. That awful military defeat that led to Saul and Jonathan's death would never happen again. Almost like, remember what happened. The passage also mentions something called the book of Jashar. In Hebrew, that word Jashar means upright. And so actually the title is probably something like, this is the book of the upright. And scholars believe it was a book of epic poems about Israel's righteous heroes, but unfortunately it has been lost to antiquity. So let's think about this lament. It's curious, isn't it? In one way, it's this glowing eulogy. David makes Saul and Jonathan out to be these amazing people. For Jonathan, no problem with that. That is absolutely true. Jonathan loved the Lord. We saw that time and time again in the book of 1 Samuel. He was courageous and brave in following the Lord. He was David's loyal friend. But what about Saul? What have we learned about Saul in the story of 1 Samuel? Think about what you know of all those stories of King Saul. Do they match up what David said in that lament right there? He makes Saul out to be amazing. But what did we learn about Saul? He's a coward, selfish, ungodly, erratic, and a murderer. Why would David write a poem that makes Saul sound amazing? Why would he say that he's super upset about Saul's passing? Obviously, we can't ask David, so we only have to speculate. I wonder if David is doing something like what we do at funerals. Have you ever been in a situation where the deceased person was extremely difficult? And yet, they call the funeral a celebration of life. Deep down inside, you might be thinking, I don't want to celebrate this life. You ever been there? Maybe you know what I mean. Long ago, I attended a funeral. It was not a faith church funeral. This is before my time here. In which the person who passed away had behaved very poorly in life. In fact, years before they died, people confronted this person about their behavior. It hurt many of them. And he was wishy-washy about even receiving the truth about his behavior. Really didn't admit it. Really didn't work at reconciliation and healing in any of those relationships. And that news, when it became public, what he did to various members of the family, it like rocked the family. It wasn't like this quiet thing that was hidden. It was turmoil in the family. And years later, when he died, what do you say? I get it, because at funerals there is an emotional desire on the part of the family and friends to emphasize how great the person was, to truly celebrate their life. It's the rare funeral where the people who are giving the eulogy or the family and friend speakers bring up the sins of the deceased. So in one sense, I don't blame David too much for saying that Saul was great. What we need to know, though, is that this was an honor and shame culture. It's a little different from the way that our culture works. There's some similarities, but in honor and shame cultures, you avoid confrontation. Even if it means you avoid the truth. Why? If there's a situation where you might have to tell the truth and it will be negative or dishonoring to the person that you're talking to, in an honor and shame culture, you'll avoid the truth to preserve their honor. For example, my wife Michelle worked in Cambodia for many years. And she would go there to work with women who had been rescued from sexual trafficking, and they were survivors, and they had been taught to be seamstresses. And so my wife and her business partner were making all sorts of items that the seamstresses would actually craft. They would sew, and then the products would be sold here in the United States to help those women have a fair wage and, as they said so often, empowerment through employment. So one of the things they had to do was go to Cambodia, purchase the fabric, and then talk with the seamstresses for quality control about how to actually make the various products. Well, communication would sometimes be difficult. Michelle and the Cambodians had different primary languages. She would explain a product design to the Cambodian seamstresses, and they would nod their heads in understanding as if they totally got it. But often they didn't totally get it. And the products were not made correctly. Why would they nod their head then? Were they lying? No. It's an honor-shame culture. They didn't want to give the impression to Michelle that Michelle hadn't explained something correctly because they felt it would dishonor her. And they also didn't want to give the impression that they had not understood something correctly, because that would dishonor them. They wanted no part of shame. They only wanted to preserve honor. Well, it could be that David is doing something of the same here in this passage. Saul was the Lord's anointed, and thus he should be honored, period. Now, I'm an American, and there's part of me that reads that and says, I don't like that. I think David should have said, Jonathan was great because Jonathan was great. And I think David should have truthfully said that Saul was difficult, selfish, erratic, unwise, and from time to time, yeah, he made some good choices too. Like a true picture, a both and. Saul wasn't 100% bad, but he did a lot bad. And it bothers me that David doesn't mention any of it. Now, maybe David, if he was listening to this sermon, would simply say, I actually meant to say all those good things about Saul. I wanted to point them out. I want him to be remembered well. Maybe. I just find it curious that there's not a peep about the fact that that Saul did all these horrible things. Remember when he slaughtered the priests? 80 priests. That's just simply unhinged behavior. David doesn't mention it. So do we revise the past in order to make a more peaceful future? Some people critique those in our contemporary American culture who bring up the sins of the American past. Think about the genocide of indigenous peoples, Native Americans. Think about racialized chattel slavery that led to millions of enslaved Africans. Think about how women were barred from owning property, voting for the longest time. Think about how women still get paid less money than men for doing the same jobs in many cases. Do we just turn a blind eye to the past? No. I would suggest we face the past in order to learn from it. So I think there's a sense in which we could say that David should have done something differently here than make Saul out to be a wonderful leader. Far better to tell the truth. There's a sci-fi series called the Ender series, written by Orson Scott Card. Ender is the main character. In one of the books, called Speaker for the Dead, Ender is a priest-like figure who, instead of performing funerals, performs something called speakings. A speaking is so much more than a funeral. And to do a speaking, these priest-like people who are called speakers for the dead, they actually go and live with the family. Sometimes for months, to truly learn the family, the good, the bad, the ugly. And when they feel that they have actually truly known the family, they hold a speaking. And they tell the true story of the whole person. Now, the book is fictional, but it just rings very true to me in the sense that that is the kind of approach to a funeral that can bring great emotional and relational healing where there's been brokenness. It involves speaking the truth. In the story, family wounds were brought out into the open. They were uncovered so that they could be healed. Broken relationships were mended because the truth was told. I wish David would have told the truth here, but he didn't. And the results, finally, as we move to chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, is that there is a leadership vacuum. King Saul is dead. The crown prince is dead. Two of the other princes who would have been next in line, dead. What happens? Here's what we read in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 1 through 7. In the course of time, David inquired of the Lord, "Shall I go up to one of the towns of Judah?" he asked. The Lord said, "Go up." David asked, "Where shall I go?" "To Hebron," the Lord answered. So David went up there with his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail, the widow of Nabal in Carmel. David also took the men who were with him, each with his family, and they settled in Hebron and its towns. Then the men of Judah came to Hebron, and there they anointed David king over the tribe of Judah. When David was told that it was the men from Jabesh-Gilead who had buried Saul, he sent messengers to them to say to them, "The Lord bless you for showing this kindness to Saul your master by burying him. May the Lord now show you kindness and faithfulness, and I too will show you this same favor because you have done this. Now then, be strong and brave, for Saul your master is dead, and the people of Judah have anointed me king over them." Finally, it's been years, and David is king. The fugitive years are over. The guessing games are over. He inquires of God. God leads him to leave the Philistine area, that town of Ziklag, and go back to David's own home area of Judah. He was of the tribe of Judah, and there his fellow Judeans make him king. But they don't make him king over all Israel. He's only king over their tribe. There's 11 other tribes. Saul had been king over all of them. So now the people of Israel have a very interesting situation. There are 12 tribes. The king is dead. One tribe takes action to anoint a king over their one tribe, Judah. What's going to happen in the others? Are they going to follow suit? Are there going to be 12 different kings of Israel? Is there going to be disunity? Is there going to be civil war? We have to think about the fact that King Saul's family is not completely eradicated. 3 of his sons were dead, but isn't there a line of succession? Yes, there is. It's called primogeniture. And it means that first, the king's sons become king, in order of oldest to youngest, and then it goes to daughters, oldest to youngest, and if there are no children left, it then goes to the king's siblings, and so on. Saul's whole family was not destroyed in the battle. It was just Saul and his 3 sons, his 3 oldest. We're going to learn that there are others still alive. Find out about that next week. For now, I want us to think about how people honor their leaders. You saw those pictures. I asked you to think about the emotions that different leaders bring up inside of you. Right here in 2 Samuel chapter 2, verses 5 through 7, David honors people who honored King Saul, those people of Jabesh-Gilead. They were courageous. They went undercover secretly at night, and they rescued the body of Saul and his sons. And as we see in the lament, though I mentioned to you I'm kind of personally uncomfortable with it, I have to hand it to David. His lament properly honors leaders who have passed away. David also orders the capital punishment of one who did not honor the Lord's anointed. There's a persistent theme then in these chapters. Honor leaders, even when they're not acting honorably. And that's very appropriate for us today. How are you feeling lately about the bombardment of election commercials, text messages, mailers, on and on? Now, we might have strong opinions about candidates, and our strong opinions can cause us to become dishonorable towards candidates. Our strong opinions can cause us to become dishonorable towards people who have different opinions of those candidates. But no matter what it is that causes us bitterness, let us remember that every single one of those candidates and every single one of the people who respect a candidate or agree with them are simply people like us. We're all made in the image of God. We are all valued by God and loved by God. And we should honor all of them as people who are loved by God. Paul even writes this in 1 Timothy chapter 2. He says, "I urge then, first of all, that petitions, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God our Savior, who wants all people to be saved and to come to a knowledge of the truth. Therefore, I want the men everywhere to pray, lifting up holy hands without anger or disputing. That goes for your bosses who rub you the wrong way. That goes for those teachers that are difficult. That goes for your coach who maybe isn't giving you enough playing time. That goes for the church leaders that maybe are even sitting in this same room that you feel are difficult. Some of you have come to me over the years telling me about those kinds of leaders. Maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a coach, and how difficult they have been and how you've struggled with them. I've had some leaders in my world who are also difficult. There have been people that have thought that I was difficult. Well, Paul will also write this in Romans 13. Let everyone be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right, and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, Paul says. For rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment to the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. Get this, Paul even says this. He says, this is also why you pay taxes. For the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, pay revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor. Now, I'm not saying that honoring leaders means that we have to agree with everything they say or everything they do or all their policies. I'm not saying that honoring leaders means we even avoid speaking the truth. There are times when we speak truth to power. It's a very biblical thing to do. We see Jesus doing it. But when we do that, we do it with honor. As Paul writes in Ephesians 4:15, speak the truth in love. Honor doesn't mean agreement. We can disagree honorably. We can disagree with kindness and love. We also show honor to those people we disagree with when we disagree with humility. What I'm saying is, leave the door open for the possibility that we are wrong in how we've been viewing things. We might have built up months, even years, of an impression about someone that they are awful. There's almost always more to people than we realize. That leader that you think is totally dishonorable, totally wrong, if you get to know them on a surface level, they're always going to be dishonorable, wrong. But if you go deeper, if you actually spend time with them, you might be shocked that there's more to them than meets the eye. I have a TV show idea. I think this would be a hit. I would call it the padded room. You build a padded room and you fill that thing with hidden cameras. The people inside the padded room cannot get out. And that way it's just like a big jail cell, kind of. They also can't get hurt because the walls and the floor are padded and the ceiling is really high. And the people stay in there for as long as it takes. Now what does that mean? As long as it takes. And hold on a sec, I'll get there. Before, I want to add that I need to tell you who will be in the padded room. 2 people. 1 from each of the major political parties. There's no decor. There's no cell phones, no devices, no nothing. And they stay in that room as long as it takes. Till what? Till they let their guards down. And we get to see their humanity. Till they express their fears, their joy, their realness. Till they actually see each other as humans. and can be civil and honorable to one another. Can you imagine? I think that would be a great TV show. Might be boring for a long time, but you could edit out those boring parts. But we don't need a padded room, do we? We can choose to be honorable even to those who are not honorable. So who is that in your life? Who do you struggle with? David really struggled with King Saul. And yet, amazingly, mysteriously sometimes, he chose honor. Is there someone in your life who you just don't see eye to eye with, and you struggle to honor them? What can you do to honor them in a new way in your heart and in your actions? Maybe it's asking God, Lord, I don't know what to do here. Transform my life by your Holy Spirit. Now, again, I'm not saying it means that you agree with them and their viewpoints or their actions. It's okay to have different viewpoints, but to still be honorable. Honor doesn't erase wrong or poor decisions, but it chooses to see the other person's humanity. It chooses to see that the other person is made in the image of God, loved by God, valuable to God. And thus, honor shows respect. It listens attentively. It gives special recognition when that is due. It shows value for the other person's humanity. Maybe there's someone in your life, maybe it is that politician, or maybe it's someone right in your own family where you need to ask God to help you to see the other person as he does. Who is it? Let us be a people who honor the dishonorable.